All right, I think we're good to go. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Alex Vatanka, Senior Fellow and the Director of the Iran Program at the Middle East Institute here in Washington. And I welcome you all to today's event, The Role of Women in Iran's Future. MEI is fortunate to have such an esteemed group of panelists who will be discussing how women are leading the fight to a better Iran and are shaping the future of the country. I'm pleased to introduce Samira Qaeri, who will be moderating the panel today. Samira is a journalist working at Radio Farda covering political news. Prior to joining Radio Farda, she worked in various Iranian newspapers for over 10 years. The panelists look forward to taking audience questions through Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can all find on the top of your screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question on Twitter with hashtag MEI event or email at events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please email events@mei.edu. Feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. Samira will be looking at all of your questions and will factor in as many as possible into the discussion. And with that, Samira, we'll introduce the panelists and begin the discussion. Samira, it's all yours. Please take it from here.
Thank you so much, Alex. Just on a quick note, my family name is Qarai. Thank you so much for introducing me. I'm very pleased and very honored to moderate this panel today with our prestigious experts and speakers who are very involved and very active in matters related to women issues and women rights in Iran under the Islamic Republic. I'm honored to present Azadeh Purzand, the co-founder and director of Siamak Purzand Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to freedom of expression in Iran. Azadeh is a human rights researcher and a UN advocacy senior consultant at Impact Iran. Azadeh, if you want to say a word to our audience.
Thank you very much, Samira. I'm honored to be part of this panel, and I hope to be able to address as much as possible issues regarding to women's rights activism during this panel.
Thank you. I'm also very delighted to introduce to you Gisu Nia, our non-resident fellow with Middle East programs at the Atlantic Council. Gisu is a human rights activist. She lectures and publishes widely on human rights developments in the Middle East and North Africa. Gisu, go ahead if you want to say hi to our audience.
Hi, everyone. Very pleased to be with you here virtually today. Looking forward to a lot of audience engagement and questions from you all. I'll be setting up a bit of the laws as it affects Iranian women. And so I'll dive into that, but great to be here with all of you.
Thanks, Gisu. And the last speaker will be Nader Shamlu, former senior advisor to the chief economist at World Bank. She's a very savvy in economical matters and a true expert for Persian media. When we need analysis or explanations on economical matters, we try to reach out to Ms. Shamlu. If you want to say hi, Nader Jan. You're on mute.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's my great pleasure to be with you, with the other panelists, with Gisu and with Azadeh Jan, whom I know for a long, long time. And I'm very much looking forward to a very rich discussion today. And you know, it's the right time to have this conversation. Thank you so much for inviting me.
I thank all of you for joining us, and I'm truly looking forward to having a fruitful, tangible, and innovative discussion and getting a sense of what is really happening in Iran and what role women are playing and will play in our better future. So we will start with Gisu Nia. Gisu, you are very much focused on law. And today I would like to ask you to first briefly talk about the efforts that we are witnessing inside Iran and outside of Iran that are challenging these discriminatory laws through the courts or advocacy efforts, and how international organization can help to bring that, to realize that.
Great. So in thinking about the title of this panel and the fact that we're talking about Iran, Iranian women's role in the future, we all thought that it would be important to speak a bit about how we got here. You know, what's the history? Just a brief overview. Also, because many of you in the audience will probably be very familiar with that. Some of you may not be as familiar with that, but we need to look a bit at the history. And so I'm going to keep these remarks really brief, but you know, in terms of the current status, I think it just to, you know, there's in terms of laws, there are gender discriminatory laws, which are discriminatory on their face. And then there are laws where the application of those laws is what is gender discriminatory. And perhaps they're more applied a bit more harshly to women. And that is the case for many morality crimes, for instance. And then there's the lived experience. What is very interesting about Iran is that unlike some countries where the culture really dictates a lot of how women are treated or the sort of challenges that they face, in Iran, there's a real disconnect between what's in the law and how women are treated in the family, in the community. And I think that disconnect is something that's quite interesting because you don't see it necessarily across the globe. Sometimes laws are more in line with how women are treated generally, but in Iran, there's quite a disparity there. But the reason that this is important is because that has been sort of the core of what women have been challenging and working towards progress on since 1979 and far before that, but also after 1979. So very briefly, a lot of people are really surprised to hear that the women's rights movement in Iran has been around for so long. It can actually trace its origins to the constitutional revolution of 1906, when women were advocating for equal education rights. And after the Pahlavis, which is the former monarchy in Iran, after they took power in 1925, a lot of those demands for gender equality became part of the drive to transform Iran. Now, things were not perfect in that era, of course, when it came to women's rights, but a lot of progress was made. In particular, there was a family protection law that was passed in 1966 and amended in 1975 that gave women more rights relating to marriage, divorce, inheritance. By the time the Iranian Revolution came about, women could vote, run for political office, and they could be judges. However, many of these rights were swiftly peeled back in the years following the 1979 revolution. Just to touch on some, very quick things that happened. Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the first supreme leader of the Islamic Republic, in February, right after the Islamic Republic came into being, he suspended the family protection law. He called it un-Islamic and he disbanded the family courts. And remember, that was the legislation that really had enhanced women's rights. Shortly after that, he prohibited women from serving as judges. He announced that women could no longer initiate divorce proceedings. Women were prohibited from serving in the army. And on March 7th, 1979, really on the eve of International Women's Day, Khomeini decreed that women could work outside the home, but that government-employed women should wear hijab or Islamic covering to work. And that sort of set into play something that met with very fierce resistance from women and their male allies. But eventually hijab became compulsory for all women in 1983 after Iran's parliament, the Majlis, passed a law that made non-observance a crime. And so that really sets the stage for the sorts of things that people, women and their male allies have been championing ever since. I think Azadeh will speak a bit to the sort of grassroots movements and the kind of developments that we've seen around that, but there have been a lot of grassroots campaigns to challenge these discriminatory laws, and they exist to today. So where are we today in terms of the law? There's quite a lot to dive into, but I'll give just a very brief overview of where we're at. I mean, Iranian women have made some progress since 1979, but they're still treated unequally. Women, regardless of their religion, must follow the hijab dress code when they're in public. The legal marriage age is 13 for girls, and girls as young as 9 may be married with the permission of their fathers or court. This has been the subject of parliamentary motions in recent years to lift that marriage age, but it hasn't been successful. Women have very few rights in terms of divorce. Men may marry up to 4 permanent wives and an infinite number of temporary wives at any one time. Custody and guardianship for women are very limited, and women do not have equitable inheritance rights to men. And a woman's testimony is regularly discounted as worth half that of a man's. So in terms of legal proceedings and things like that, her testimony is not worth as much. However, the picture is not all grim. There have been some gains. For example, previously, the Civil Code had provided that only Iranian fathers can pass their citizenship on to their children. But just last year, that was changed. And that was the result of many years of internal advocacy and also engagement from the international community. But that has changed. The law is not without its flaws in terms of it not being an automatic grant to the children of Iranian women who have foreign spouses. And also there's a security check that's required, but nonetheless, some progress. And in June 2019, so just this past June, Iran's Supreme Court upheld a law deciding that diya, or what's called blood money, which is compensation that's paid to relatives for the death or injury of a family member, is now equal between a man and a woman. So under Sharia law, under Islamic law, the women's diya was half that of a man's, but the lawmakers in Iran got a bit creative and created a national fund that would pay out the other half of that. And so they made it equal. Now, of course, that also came under criticism for not acknowledging the inherent inequality between men and women. Nonetheless, I think that example shows the sort of creativity that can also be at play here in terms of women trying to constructively think through solutions to improve their status under the law and how lawmakers can react to that. So just to close on this point, I mean, my primary takeaway is that the Iranian authorities, despite the criticism from inside Iran about the status of women under the law and outside Iran, they continue to propose and implement laws that discriminate against women and impose further restrictions on their already limited rights. But there is this sort of fierce resistance from inside the country. And there are constructive ways that the international community can help. And I say constructive because I think it's very important to focus on the ways that can be helpful and really try to delineate that. And one clear example I think of that is what happened last year in fall of 2019, where for the first time in almost 4 decades, women were allowed to buy tickets and attend a football match in Iran, a soccer match in Iran. And that happened after years of advocacy from women inside the country, really demanding that they be let inside the stadiums. But this also happened because there was a sort of catalytic moment with a soccer fan who had self-immolated after she had been arrested for trying to enter a stadium. And the outcry that also happened on the outside. So, you know, there was efforts from Iranian soccer players, but there was also a lot of noise made by international soccer players in solidarity with the women's desire to enter the stadiums. And FIFA, the football's global governing body, really finally entered that debate and made it clear to the Iranian authorities that women should be allowed to attend international matches. And I think that that sort of complementarity between what's going on the inside and also the sort of constructive engagement on the outside to help further these demands is really where we need to go in terms of progress.
So thank you, Gisu. Only very few notes. One is related to the nationality law, which is has not been executed. We have few months ago, we have a letter from one of Iranian parliament members to our president. She mentioned, Tayyebe Siavashi, she mentioned that there is no successful cases related to that. it's been passed, that's true, but we don't have still one single successful case. And also about the financial atonement, I think we will continue discussing this more with Azadeh as well. Only to just go to our live chats, Gisu, there is one audience asking, why are you starting from 1900? Why you don't go back to the time of Qurratul Ain and Taheret, the woman who took out her veil? Do you have an answer to our audience for that? Why we don't go back in time to 18?
Oh, you mean why don't we go previously before 1906?
Yeah, that's what he's asking.
Oh, well, we can debate when these things started and when women's sort of liberation began, but I'm trying to keep my remarks a bit brief. And also because we're focusing on the future and maybe some more contemporary developments, just wanted to lay out some history for anybody who's not in the know, but it sounds like our audience member has much more in-depth knowledge than maybe some of the other folks on the line. So
yeah, I hope that was an answer for our audience. Azadeh, do you want to continue from where Gisu talked about the DLA, and one of our audience members asking about why the Supreme Court changed this law, and do you want to answer that?
Thank you so much. I think Gisu's remarks were a perfect baseline for where I'm going to take us briefly. Also, I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. If you allow me, I'll come back to that question because I don't want to. And again, I will answer based on what I speculate, but the timing of it would be something that I probably wouldn't know. But anyways, I'll come back to it. I think one thing that I very much agree with Gisu, and I think it's very important to keep bringing this up in policy circles in particular is sort of a quick, even if it's in an overview style, going back to history and reminding audiences and policy making circles interested in Iran that many of the things that we talk about Iran and women's rights and women's participation, these are not really new. I mean, we have a full history of women's, for instance, participation in uprisings. I saw that in the event description, the November 2019 uprisings and women being sort of at the forefront of that came through. And I wanted to take something like this and talk about, for instance, women, as Gisu mentioned, the constitutional revolution, the Islamic revolution, then we had the Green Movement, the 2017 nationwide protests, 2019 nationwide protests, and also many smaller scale uprisings that we've had. Women have been at the forefront of these uprisings. And what has happened in most of these situations, especially with the two revolutions that we have experienced, is that women at the end don't get what they demand. I mean, in fact, they get sidelined. And I think that's a warning for us sitting here today that, with all the activism that women have been involved in, with all the not just legal change, but social change, economic change, you name it, that they have tried to push forward, there is always a risk that they're going to be sidelined. And this is not only by the Islamic Republic, which we know as a government that always sidelines women's rights issues, also by opposition groups. This happened after during the Islamic Revolution. So in the end, women seem to be to be sort of a key factor in making a lot of change happen. And then when the change happens, they get sidelined. And I think, at least for me, this is something that I'm always very much aware of when I think about Iran. And in terms of women and their activism and their sort of drive to make change happen in Iran, I think it's women of Iran have something to teach to the whole world today, which is really making any obstacle and turning it into an opportunity. As we see in COVID-19 era, we are in a situation when everyone is talking about agility, resilience, opportunities from challenges, a new way of living. And how I see women's life in Iran is that their challenges haven't decreased, they just keep getting new challenges. And even when they managed to, what, for instance, Kisu mentioned with the nationality law, the nationality law has at least 40 years of activism behind it. When the Islamic Republic passes the nationality law, let's for a second pause on the outcome of it. We will get to it. The world congratulates the Iranian government. The world forgets to remember that there are generations of women behind the advocacy that went to this, and not just one way of advocacy. There were women who thought it's best to talk with the government and to try to convince the government. There were women who thought it's best to call out the government. There were women who were journalists and used their journalism power. There were women who were lawyers and did what they could. There were religious women. There were secular women. And this gets lost in translation, and we get into this singular story of there is one way of change in Iran, and there is one way of sort of moving forward. And then once the change happens, the congratulations and the applause goes to, let's say, the more moderate or the less moderate or whatever fragments of the Iranian government. And so for instance, going to the staying on the nationality law example. Another challenge that I think Iranian women and in general probably Iran has is that we are very Tehran-centric as a nation. We're a very nationalistic nation, and when it comes even to women's rights activism, the attention of especially the West is on Tehran. Nationality law is a serious challenge for let's say Baluchi women in Sistan Baluchistan, where they're already deprived of many problems and of many opportunities.
I am sorry to interrupt you. Just one of our audience is asking, what is this nationality law that you're talking about? Can you give us a brief?
Absolutely. I try to be brief about it. So basically it means that a woman, before this law was passed, by law, when a woman was not allowed to pass on her Iranian nationality to her children if she was married to a non-Iranian person. Which was an issue very much close to the heart of the Iranian diaspora, because many Iranian women have married non-Iranian men and have children and would like their children to get Iranian passports and be able to go to Iran. And I think my point was that, like, when we got this law, the focus was now, now those of us Iranian American or Iranian European women who are married to non-Iranian men, we can now pass on our nationality. But what was lost there, again, in translation, in talking about policy and talking about change, was that the advocacy was very much done on a very grassroots level. This was for Baluch women, who are a minority in Iran, highly discriminated against. Many of them are also Sunni, so they have the intersectionality when it comes to discrimination, ethnicity, religious, and being a woman. And then they're married to Afghan migrants who are oftentimes also undocumented. So then they have children out of wedlock, and these children would not have access to education, adequate education, healthcare, and so on. And this problem still remains. Part of that nationality law amendment talks about the fact that you have to, the husband has to go through a clearance, a security clearance process, which is not the case for a man who is passing on his nationality. And for exactly this most marginalized population, many of whom in their limited ways, they tried to be vocal about this once they found out that this is a right. They will not be able to get this right because their Afghan husbands most likely will not pass the security clearance. And so I think, at least for my focus and my interest is always try to go beyond what the Western media and the policy circles pay attention to. When it comes to, for instance, the November protests, we had many women not just visually involved in the protests. We had, for instance, women from Khuzestan in Ahvaz, the Arab women who sell yogurt and milk, who were very much from the beginning part of these protests. And again, they were not really highlighted in the news that we get and in the information that we receive. Another thing I wanted to talk about, if I have time, quickly, is that on top of the repression that we see in Iran, on top of the discriminatory laws, long sentences for women's rights activists, I also, at least in my work, I also think that Iran remains a patriarchal society, especially as we try to kind of delve deeper into the issues. And many women have had to also deal with that challenge. So it's not just, so you have basically the governing rulers that put obstacles against you, and then you have a patriarchal community. And then on top of that, the way I think Western policymakers have been talking about women and kind of making women like the one and only hope for the future of Iran, which in my heart I believe, but I think it's a bit of a burden on putting on women, Iranian women who are already burdened with so many challenges, and they're trying to basically make life to a certain standard, and to essentially treat them like a political party in a situation where we do not have political parties in Iran, and then burden them with this task of having to change the future of the country in a way that a particular, let's say, policymaker wants, and so on. And then also kind of pushing, and I think this is like happening in the world, it's a trend. The excessive attention on online activism, I think, takes us away from what's happening in grassroots. We are talking about a society that's highly securitized and surveilled. And many women and grassroots level, if they really want their work to be effective, they have to intentionally be quiet. They have to intentionally be in the shadows. And when we only celebrate the kind of activism that uses media exclusively, in a way we are almost neglecting and sidelining the people who cannot use the same kind of platforms if they want to be effective on the ground. And I think that's I will just kind of end with this. I think that's something that we should really, really pay attention when we talk about women and the future of Iran. And at the end, my takeaway is resilience. Women of Iran have shown nothing but resilience in the many years that we have observed Iran. And also, I would like to really caution us not to, again, make a singular story. Women of Iran are as diverse as Iran is, politically, economically, ethnically, religiously, with the approach of activism. And I think if we miss that, we will miss a lot about how Iran will evolve in the future and where we will be in a few years. Regarding the question on DIA, again, I don't know about the timing, but I think it's similar to my point about the nationality law. Decades of activism went behind this, and with DIA in particular, I would say that there have been women who have been imprisoned for their work on issues like this, and it was one of those, I think, issues that the earlier generations of women's rights activists tried to bring in more moderate religious readings and secular understandings together in order to be able to find openings within a religious political structure. So again, my short answer is women's activism is the reason behind it, and for the timing, I wouldn't know more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Azadeh. We will go back to these issues later on because the question is still there that if a law is not serving a citizen, how can it be useful and how can it be practiced anyhow? But there are some audience asking about the high amount of women enrolling in universities and the rise we see in the numbers of women students. We will go to that if our audience can stay a little bit patient. Let's continue our discussion with Ms. Shamlu. Ms. Shamlu, I think you believe that even though we are witnessing all these discriminations against women, Iranian women progressed in every field. That's what you think. But right now we are in a pandemic. How this COVID-19 is gonna affect the Iranian movement and this progress that Iranian women started to make?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. And the discussions by Gisu and Azad are very, very interesting and very, of course, pertinent to the topic. Let me maybe come back to this question that you posed, because it is something that I mean, the whole issue about how is COVID-19 going to change the world and going to change the way that we will work in the future, not only for Iran, but for every country. And I want to come back to that very shortly. But I just want to make one point, which is that all of these laws and you know, some of the laws that we mentioned, for instance, the whole issue with citizenship law, nationality law, and many others, are based on the premise that the woman is a homemaker, that the husband takes care of the woman, that the man takes care of the woman. And as a result, when you even look at laws in the United States, I mean, the laws, for instance, that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Justice Ginsburg, overturned in the United States Supreme Court, they all dealt with the issue that women are no longer able to get the protection of the men, or no longer want the protection of the men, that they can protect themselves, that they can fend for themselves, and that also men are no longer able to kind of, that model that the husband is always the breadwinner, that the husband is taking care of the family, is no longer holding. And that model is very much under pressure, if not extinct, but certainly under pressure. And I think we experienced that in Iran as well. We experienced the fact that the husband, the man of the family, can no longer be the sole breadwinner. And as a result of that, we see this I would say, this conflict that is taking place. And what I would like to stress is that while the advocacy for many of the laws and regulations that were overturned during the 1979 are very, very much appropriate and well placed, but I think that not enough has been given, not enough attention has been given to rights that impact women's economic opportunities, economic rights. And as a result of that, Iranian women face a large number of discriminatory regulations, laws, small decrees here and there when it comes to their economic opportunities. And as a result of that, I think more attention needs to be given to these spheres of law, I would say. For instance, you know, we are talking about DA. The actual reason why this DA was changed, or they have tried to find the reason for it, is because that if I am, let's say, walking down the street in Tehran and I get into an accident and I lose an arm, and my husband loses an arm, he gets twice as much for the loss of that, let's say, of his limb. Whereas I could be very much perhaps the main breadwinner of the family, and maybe I am the one that is going to be the one that, you know, whose loss of limb is more consequential for the family. So in other words, there are a lot of issues that are going on in Iran that impact women's economic rights and economic opportunities. Now, coming back to the issue of COVID-19, I think it's very, when we look at the world, it's very interesting that, you know, everyone says we are in a war against the virus, we're in a war against the, you know, whatever, this problem. But can you imagine if we had been in a war, in no other war where killing is the goal? We would never run out of ammunition, we will never run out of bombs, we will never run out of anything. But now that we are in a war to save livings, we are running out of the very simple, I would say, stuff that we need for every day to find this one. So I think that there is going to be a very, very much of a deep down and profound soul searching of how we want to schedule, how we want to maybe organize our futures, our societies going forward. And what this war, I mean, what this environment has shown us is that the resilience of the family as a whole, regardless of where they are, whether they're in the United States, in the Midwest, in New York, or in Iran, in Mashhad, in, I don't know, in Baluchistan. It's the resilience of the family that is very critical at making sure that we not only face this one-time threat, but then the threat throughout. So already what I'm seeing inside Iran, and I'm in contact with many activists in Iran, as well as with many people that have come to work with Iran, is that there is a new dynamic taking shape within the family, that men who probably before didn't realize that, you know, their wives maybe second income as, you know, I don't know, cutting vegetables or onions and selling them to others, may not have paid attention to that income. Suddenly they're realizing, oh, you know what, we need that income. We need that empowerment of the woman. So I think that there is a little bit of a silver lining, and a little bit of silver lining, that the empowerment, the opportunities for women that have been previously perhaps not taken seriously are as much important to creating a resilient society, a resilient family, as has been before. Now, one of the things that actually amazes me is that all the things that women have been asking for, like flex time, telecommuting, work-family balance, and all of these things are in fact the few wherewithals, the few tools that we have today to be able to manage in our societies, again, regardless of where we are, whether we are in China or whether we are in New York City, to actually be able to manage our society. So in other words, I think women's demands and what women have been advocating for in any society are going to be at the center of the politics of the future. I think that they're going to be they're going to shape the agendas going forward in every society, and whoever and whichever politician or party or representative doesn't pay attention to women's demands, to women's needs, is going to be facing, I would say, I hope extinction, but certainly would have a lot of difficulties going forward. And therefore, I think that this is an opportunity we can perhaps capitalize on, because not so much for women for the sake of women, but for the sake of our societies. And I have just one more comment on what Bisujan was mentioning, which is that the laws in Iran are perhaps very quite discriminatory. Actually, the World Bank, IFC, do a periodic review of laws across the world, certainly laws that affect women's economic empowerment. And what they have found is that Iran has the third highest, 23 something incidences. And I'm just talking about laws with respect to economic opportunities. I'm not talking about divorce laws or any other ones. That Iran has one of the highest impediments, even in comparison with other Muslim majority countries. So in other words, if some people are there to advocate that we need to have these discriminations because they are in accordance with Sharia, no, but other Muslim countries have been able to overcome them. So there is no reason why we in Iran shouldn't be overcoming those laws as well. But what surprises me is that Iranian women have advanced in every field. Wherever I go, be it in art, be it in sports, be it in everything, Iranian women have essentially kind of disregarded whatever the discriminations are and have actually advanced. And the issue with the advancing in academia, in universities, I have to make one point, is that actually women across the world are outnumbering men in universities. So it's not just Iran. Iran is actually in the same trend. But nonetheless, women have advanced, women have disregarded whatever impediments they have in front of them. They have just essentially just galloped across those hurdles, and I'm sure that the future of not only Iran, but every society rests with what women want and how men are supporting those demands as well. I shouldn't leave out our friends, our male friends, because I think that they are also part of the solution.
Thank you so much, Nader Jan. We have so many questions that I really like to answer them. They are very interesting and they involve such interesting topics, very diverse. But I just would like to ask our speakers to keep it as short as they can so we can answer more questions in our very limited time. Gisu, there is one question for you. Actually, in your first answer, you mentioned something very interesting, and that was about the difference we are witnessing between the cultural practices in Iran and Iranian law. Rong is asking you if you can elaborate more on this, about this disparity between Iranian law and culture practice. What do you mean? What did you mean by that?
So for example, I'll just give a few quick examples. One is that, mandatory hijab laws, right? That's not uniform across the Middle East and North Africa. It's not uniform in Muslim majority countries. It's not mandated that everybody has to cover, right? That every woman has to cover. And I feel, but in a lot of those countries, women elect to do that. It would be unheard of, when I've lived in different parts of the Middle East, it would be unheard of to come out uncovered if you were somebody who was a local, and you would do it for your protection. You would do it to show that you're chaste. You would do it for any number of reasons. I don't think we can say that the same holds true for Iranian women. I think one reason we see such a fierce and emphatic anti-mandatory hijab campaign is because of the sort of cultural practices and the fact that not all women felt compelled to be veiled. So I think that's one example of what I mean by disparity, where the law is quite extreme in what it mandates, and that doesn't necessarily reflect the cultural practices of the women, versus in other countries where actually maybe a lot of people would choose to do that, but it's not mandated under law. That's one area, for example. Another is in regards to practices like FGM, female genital mutilation, right? There's no law in Iran really that prohibits that. There's been discussions and there's been some nods to that, but that may be a cultural practice in some areas of the country, but it's not prevalent, right? And so again, those are areas where there is something that happens in culture versus what is mandated or not explicitly prohibited by law, right? I could go on and on, but that's a bit of the examples. And in other countries, sometimes you see more of an alignment between what's on the books in terms of what is a de jure law, and then also what is de facto, the practices that happen, or what's like the understood version of what's acceptable in a society.
Okay, Azadeh, I have a question for you from Catherine. She's asking, how are divorced women treated under the law?
Well, I think this would go to the custody question. If women who would have children, the law is unequal when it comes to the custody of the children with the mother and the father. So the discrimination. So while they face discrimination in if they wanted to seek divorce themselves, it's very difficult. You have to have only a few reasons to be able to have the right to divorce, and then if their husbands have want to seek divorce, it's quite easy, so they have little defense, the women. So they go through that level of legal discrimination, and then afterwards is the question of custody and children and motherhood comes into place more than anything else. But I also want to take this and quickly mention a couple of other things. As I have heard from colleagues who work in some of the more marginalized areas, we see that outside the law, we see this issue of you can verbally or via text message or something say 3 times like I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you as a man, and you can divorce a woman. And we have been seeing, as I have heard from colleagues, an increase in that in some of the provinces in Iran. That's again something that's not necessarily because by the law, but it's putting women at a marginalized place. And I think the question of divorced women in the society used to probably face much more taboos than they do today, but still there are difficulties in getting by in your daily life. Although I think, again, thanks to all the work that women have done, this taboo is very much less than it used to be, and there are fewer barriers, but there are some social barriers that a woman would then have to face.
Great, thank you so much. There is another question about domestic violence. Nowadays, with Corona and COVID-19, we are witnessing a rise in domestic violence in Iran. We had news related to this, and one of our audience is asking about the current and historic situation on domestic violence. Maybe Gisu, do you want to answer that?
Sure. I can get into it very briefly. So there's a number of changes that I think needs to happen to be able to provide access to justice for victims of domestic violence. We have a situation in which I would say that there's an unwillingness of various state institutions to investigate domestic violence, to punish perpetrators, to provide appropriate social services to victims. And for example, so domestic violence, if we're looking at like, let's say sexual assault as well, or like rape within the marital home, the Islamic Penal Code, Iran's Islamic Penal Code doesn't classify rape as a distinct crime, right? So instead it defines it as zina, adultery and fornication without consent. And for punishment, rape could be a capital offense. Yet, if a person charged with rape, so that could be a husband, right, who had, done something to his wife, if he repents to a judge's satisfaction, he can receive a prison sentence ranging from 6 months to 2 years. So not a capital offense, or lashes, or both. And so I would say there's a disparity between what can actually happen under the law. And because of that, and because of the lack of, the ability of state institutions to really address that trickles down to I think the main problem being that domestic violence happens all over the world, of course, but that in Iran, there's not necessarily the state structures, institutions, or the laws to address what should happen to those who actually perpetrate that. And things that happen inside of a marital relationship are sometimes not even acknowledged as a form of violence, a form of sexual assault, or not. So I have a whole list of things that I could recommend to change that could help with that, both in the laws and the institutions that serve them. But that in a nutshell is what I see as the problem there.
We have another question, Gisu, related to what you were just talking about. She's asking, does Iran recognize Mercial rape in the law? Do you know that?
No, because so I could get into, I don't want to get too heavy into all the rape laws, but there's not a sufficient definition of rape in the Islamic Penal Code, and it's not in accordance with international human rights instruments such as the Istanbul Convention. So that's just not recognized. So we have a struggle worldwide to acknowledge marital rape as a form of rape. But I would say that in Iran, we actually have a bigger struggle, which is that there's not even an adequate definition of what rape is to be able to then get into marital rape. So no.
Okay.
Can I make a comment on two things that were on the topic of divorced women? there is, of course, there is a stigma, but still, the stigma, when we see the divorce rates rising, it means that, more and more women opt for going. In my generation, it was really unheard of for women to divorce, but now it has become a fairly commonplace, and divorce rates have been rising. I think that within the Iranian law, there is the people who are really a bit I would say, left in the no man's land are actually married women, because again, married women are considered to be the secondary person in the marriage. So in other words, the husband is the head of the household, he is the breadwinner, he is this, that. Whereas divorced women are considered to be the heads of household. So whatever, and also the same thing goes for non-married women. So whatever, let's say, in terms of social protection, in terms of unemployment, in terms of benefits that the state would give, could go to the divorced woman, but is not necessarily going to the married woman, because she is supposed to have received those benefits through her husband. Let me give you an example. For instance, if we have a wife who is a school teacher and a husband who's a taxi driver, as a school teacher, she would, for instance, be able to get a social insurance, let's say health insurance. But because of the fact that the husband is the head of the household, she will not be entitled to pass on that social insurance to her husband and her children, because she is not considered to be the head of the household. Whereas if you are a divorced woman, you can have that you can pass on that social insurance, health insurance, anything else to your children, because you're considered to be the head of household. So I think that in many ways, the married woman in Iran, the marriage laws are the ones where they put the woman as a secondary citizen to the man. So that's one point that I wanted to make. The other point that I wanted to make is that even though the laws are discriminatory, women have found incredible ways to bypass the laws. I mean, for one thing, for instance, when you look at the marriage contract, the marriage contract gives the women the right upfront before they sign on the dotted line, essentially, to have the right to divorce, to have the right to determine that they can work, to have the right to many rights that the law essentially denies them. They can request those rights within the marriage and within the marriage contract. That is. Now, what the problem is, of course, it creates a disparity among women. In other words, women who have asked for that sort of protection, and women who didn't know of their rights and didn't ask for the protection.
But that is not voluntary. Doesn't it come from the cultural statues of the woman?
Whatever, the woman, yeah, I think that I agree with you. It is how well informed, how well informed the woman is. So we need to actually work on the woman for her to know what her rights are, to know that she can ask she can put that in the divorce, in the marriage contract, that she has the right to divorce. I give another example. I was once asking a woman entrepreneur, I said, with all of these difficult laws that you have in Iran, how do you manage to sort of like go against a male partner? She said, what I do is whenever I want to do anything, I get a power of attorney that I can do X, Y, Z. I can everything that the law denies to me, and I can essentially put those whatever powers of attorney to work. So what I'm trying to say is that the knowledge of women of how they can bypass the discriminatory laws is as important in the implementation or in the non-implementation of those laws. And I think that there are ways, and many women do bypass these laws because of the fact that they know which ways, what instruments to use to essentially get their rights, to push themselves forward.
Azadeh, there is a question for you from Sufia. She's asking you, within all the issues women are fighting for in Iran and outside, which are one or two which you would like to highlight and why? And another question is that what is another aspect you can think of that Western media has barely covered?
On the question of prioritization, while I really appreciate this question because I think we do need some focus when we try to support what is being done on the ground, I do want to warn that the question of prioritization of issues women struggling with is something that I have noticed governments like the Islamic Republic likes to do. And they usually, as much as I agree 100% with Nader Jan on the importance of talking about social and cultural and economic related issues, I also, where I sit and in my work, I see many times the Iranian government comes and talks about those as achievements, marginalizing the legal discriminations that women face within family law, marginalizing civil and political liberties, and so on. So I don't think that I want to say what priorities are exactly because of this reason. I think we have to work across the spectrum. But also the most important thing to me is to find the connections with all these rights so that we truly are talking about when we talk about the empowerment of women is not from one angle or one dimension. So I think we need to have a more holistic approach when we look at women's empowerments and women's rights.
And also the part about the Western media, Sophia was asking.
Sorry, can you repeat that part? I didn't quite.
She was asking, in your opinion, what subjects are barely covered by Western media related to women issues?
Well, I think, like I said, my passion and interest is usually go to the things, talk about the topics that are least sort of visible and seen. And I think what we see in the Western media sometimes is a reflection on actually how we as human rights advocates reflect Iran. That the media looks at us as experts. And because we are a very Tehran-centric circle of human rights organizations, a lot of the times that have access to Western media, what happens outside of Tehran to women and to humans in general kind of gets undermined. So I would pay attention to the intersectionality of discriminations that women from minority groups face in particular, and also the very grassroots work that is being done in a lot of those kinds of provinces and areas that is under the radar because by nature it has to be under the radar.
Okay, we have very, very limited time, only a few minutes. We have so many questions about how people out of Iran can help Iranian women. I want each one of you to give a very brief answer to that question, how people can contribute. Gisu, let's start with you.
Sure. I think one thing that I've come across that is troubling for me in my work and that I think is important for us to all keep in mind is that sometimes because, certain concepts get seen as quote unquote Western, when in fact, a lot of the things that Iranian women have been pushing for, which have been maybe mislabeled by the Iranian authorities as somewhat of Western demands, right, are things that they have demanded themselves. And I feel like there's a conflation between those two things, and that sometimes, particularly in progressive left-leaning circles outside of Iran, so in North America and Europe, there becomes this discussion around cultural relativism and kind of a reluctance to actually express solidarity with those movements, to see them as something that's imposed and not the inherent desires of women inside the country. And I would urge everybody to think carefully through that framework and not sort of fall into this trap of thinking of essentially buying what the primarily older male contingent of leaders would say about what these demands are. It's not for them to label it. Those are not the people who are bringing those demands forward. We should be listening to the voices inside the country that are asking for things, and understand that those demands are to be taken seriously and not fall into this trap of mislabeling. I see that a lot in different narratives that are built, and it's not a progressive narrative. It's not a narrative of solidarity, and it's not a narrative that helps progress women's rights as a whole globally. So it kind of falls into an anti-imperialist frame as well. Just because you think certain things about some countries doesn't mean that you should have this sort of very opposite reaction that I think does not show solidarity. So that would be just on the framing, I think it's important.
Nader, how people out of Iran can contribute and help Iranian women?
Well, for me, I try to very much, because, you know, as we were talking about, the image of the Iranian woman being a victim is very pervasive everywhere. People think, oh, you know, we are like these poor little. What I try to do is to really celebrate and show their amazing achievements. Wherever I have a chance to introduce a woman speaker from Iran, I try to do that. I try to show them that despite, for instance, despite the fact that that Iran is under sanctions, is not doing well, you find amazing women entrepreneurs, for instance, that I haven't even found in Europe, where I do, you know, I have family in Europe, my husband is from Europe and whatever, or even in the United States, in incredibly advanced fields, in incredibly cutting edge sectors. I try to really show the world that, you know, the Iranian women are doers. They are, you know, despite every single, you know, hurdle that they face, they overcome it, and they are strong women. They are women that can shape their own destinies, and they are women that are not at all sort of like helpless and you know, helpless and victims that people imagine women are. So in other words, my effort is to really showcase their successes, the vast majority of Iranian women that are out there and are actually making every effort to advance.
And Azadeh, can you briefly
Yes, I think my wish is that in punishing the Iranian, the Islamic Republic, which deserves lots of punishing, we shouldn't be punishing women and ordinary people. And I think, you know, one of the things that the Iranian government has actually thrived on is Iran's isolation from the world, because it wants it. It wants its people to be isolated from the world. And I would say that in supporting what women are doing in Iran, we should find innovative ways that is considerate of the security consideration of many activists, and also the visa restrictions and so on, and to try and find safe spaces where women can actually have exchanges with women in the region, with women in the world, and to try to really see themselves in a bigger context, in a bigger picture, because I think that's the least that the Iranian women deserve, is to really find themselves in a bigger world. And then I think that's not just how we can support them. I think that's absolutely our responsibility as an international community, just as it is our responsibility to hold the Iranian government accountable for its atrocities against women and its people.
Thank you so much. I really thank Gisunia, Nader Shamlu, Azadeh Pourzand, our speakers, for participating in this panel. And I would like to thank all of you. 112 people were watching us. Thank you so much for giving us your time, 1 hour. And I am so sorry if we couldn't manage to answer all your questions. We did our best, but we only had 1 hour. It was very limited. So thank you so much for watching, and stay safe.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Amber.
Thank you.